All right, what's going on, guys? So, welcome to Module 1 of the course. This is understanding the credit system, and the objective here is for you to understand how credit reporting actually works before you start attempting the credit repair process. All right, so the credit reporting ecosystem. First thing we want to go over are, of course, the three credit bureaus. Their responsibilities are collecting credit information from lenders, maintaining consumer credit files, and they have to be accurate, providing credit reports to lenders, right? Investigating disputes submitted by consumers, updating or deleting inaccurate information. And an important thing to clarify is that bureaus do not create the information on your credit report. They simply just store and distribute the data that's provided by your lenders or collection agencies. But this is why the FCRA is so important. And this is why what's called accuracy of reporting depends heavily on the actual data furnisher, not necessarily the credit bureaus. A lot of people get that confused. Now let's deal with data furnishers. These are banks, lenders, and collection agents on your credit reports, or that's furnished by the credit bureaus. And examples of these type of data furnishers are banks, credit card issuers, mortgage lenders, auto lenders, debt collectors, credit unions, financing companies, etc. Right? And these organizations are responsible for reporting accurate information to the credit bureau, so that information shows up on your credit report as accurate. Now, another important thing that you need to understand is what's called the eOscar system. This is the electronic online solution for complete and accurate reporting. It's the system that's used by the credit bureaus to communicate your disputes with the lenders. Now, this is all automated, basically a computer system that the bureaus have communicating with a computer system that your lender or the collection company or a furnisher has. It's essentially a centralized dispute processing network. So when you send off disputes, there's not another person on the other end that's going over your credit disputes, and your credit report is just, again, two automated systems that communicate with each other. And the participants in this, again, are the credit bureaus, banks, collection agencies, and data furnishers. And because these disputes are converted into what they call short codes, right? So it's just 3-digit number and maybe like 5 different words that's attached to that number, right? So with that, this is why lenders often never see, the full consumer dispute letter, right? When you actually send that letter in, and they're actually not viewing the full thing. The next thing that you need to understand is Metro 2 reporting standards, right? So Metro 2 is just the standard format that's used by your lender or the data furnisher to report the actual account information to the credit bureaus, right? It's not a law, it's just a system. The FCRA is the law, right? And it was developed by what's called the Consumer Data Industry Association, or the CDIA, which was itself put together by all 3 of the major credit bureaus, and I think LexisNexis, right? So every account reported to the credit bureaus must follow Metro 2 data formatting rules, right? And Metro 2 defines how lenders report account status, payment history, balances, delinquency codes, charge-offs, collections, account closures, and there's other data points as well that they report, but we'll get into some of that later on in the course. Right? So if a lender reports information incorrectly according to Metro 2 guidelines, then the account can be considered as inaccurately reported, which is a violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So now, how all 4 of these pieces work together. So the entire credit reporting system functions as what's called a data pipeline. So step 1 is where lenders report account data to Metro 2 format or using Metro 2 format. Step 2 is where the credit bureaus store and display that information. Step 3 is where you as a consumer can review your report and identify the errors. Step 4 is the dispute process, which is transmitted through eOscar. So eOscar and Metro 2 are 2 separate things, right? And then step 5 is how lenders use this system to investigate and respond to your actual disputes. So now let's go over some laws that actually govern credit reporting. So first up is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. This is the primary federal law that governs how credit information is collected, reported, shared, and disputed. This is what we leverage when we send off these disputes, right? We use the factual-based dispute method, or what we call the pre-litigation dispute method. Some people call it the Metro 2 dispute method, but it's really just the FCRA dispute method. It was, put in place to ensure that consumer credit reporting is accurate, fair, and private. Really, it was put there to ensure that it was accurate, complete, and verifiable. And that's why they instituted Metro 2, because you got all these data furnishers sending all these data to these credit bureaus, and everybody sends it a different way. They had to come up with a uniform standard that the bureaus could use to interpret that data and put them on the credit reports, right? That's what Metro 2 is. But this law right here regulates the behavior of your credit bureaus, the data furnishers, meaning the banks and lenders, and companies that access your credit reports, right? The three major credit bureaus are governed by this law. So that's Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. And this is why this law is so powerful when it comes to the dispute process. Now, some key consumer rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act: you have the right to access your report, which is Section 609. You got the right to dispute inaccurate information, which is Section 611, right? Consumers may dispute any inaccurate or incomplete information appearing on their credit report. You can also dispute anything that's unverifiable. The requirement for maximum possible accuracy, this is where it really comes down to, right? Is Section 607B, where credit bureaus must follow reasonable procedures to ensure that the information on your credit report is actually accurate. Then for inquiries or just accounts that shouldn't be on your credit reports, right? This is governed by Section 604, where a company can only access your consumer report if it has permissible purpose or authority from you to do so. This is dealing with credit applications, employment background checks, and insurance underwriting. Now, responsibilities of data furnishers falls under Section 623. We just went over who the data furnishers are. So they're governed under this law too, but you have to first initiate it with the credit bureaus. This is why on the second round, when we get further into the course, I'm going to show you how to escalate your disputes to the actual data furnishers, but you got to go through the bureaus first, right? So lenders that report information have to report accurate data. They have to investigate disputes. They have to correct errors, and failure to comply can create legal liability. And that's what we really want to harp on when it comes to the dispute process, right? Because some of you guys, you've been through the dispute process, you've been in for 6 months, 12 months and stuff, like you're still disputing the same accounts. You should have been sued the credit bureaus for non-compliance. The next law is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, or the FDCPA, which regulates how third-party debt collectors can collect and report those type of debts. Debt validation rights fall under Section 1692G, which gives you the right to request validation of debt. It protects you from harassment or abuse, restrictions on false and misleading information, and also communication restrictions. Then there's the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act, or what they call FACTA, right? This is an amendment to the FCRA that was introduced for additional consumer protections related to credit reporting and identity theft. So things like free annual credit reports, which I recommend you get your credit reports from annualcreditreport.com. You can get a free one every week, right? Identity theft protections, credit card number truncation, and then disposal rule, where companies must properly destroy your information before discarding it to prevent identity theft. Now, how these laws work together. So these three laws regulate different parts of the credit reporting system. Laws that regulate, the Fair Credit Reporting Act deal with credit bureaus and credit reporting, the FDCPA, debt collectors and collection practices, and in fact, the identity theft protections and reporting accuracy. So together, what they do is establish that legal framework that protects you from things like inaccurate credit reporting, unlawful debt collections, and identity theft and fraud. So now let's go over some key sections of this law just to kind of understand it a little more. So when you're disputing your credit report for errors that's dealing with debt collectors, right, several specific statutory provisions provide the legal foundation for your consumer rights. And understanding these sections allows you as the consumer to properly structure your disputes, request documentation, and hold the credit bureaus and these debt collectors accountable. Most important sections are 609, which is the right to request information, right? Section 611 of the Fair Credit Reporting Act and 609 of the Fair Credit Reporting Act to dispute inaccurate information. Section 623, responsibilities of debt furnishers. And then when it comes to the FDCPA, Section 1692G. These are the main sections that we're going to be leveraging to remove that negative information off your credit report. So 609, right, the right to request information. So Section 609 of the FCRA, what it does is establish your right to request disclosure of information contained on your credit report. And the purpose is to allow you as a consumer to understand what information is being reported, how it's being reported, who's furnishing that information, and who has access to your credit reports. And the responsibilities of furnishers under Section 623 of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, they have to report accurate information, again, which is very important. 90-something% of all of the negative items on a credit report are inaccurate, right? And this is what puts the ball in your court when you actually learn how to leverage this, right? Correcting errors when they're discovered. So they have a responsibility to correct these errors, which a lot of times they just don't do that, and to investigate disputes forwarded by the credit bureaus. So again, this is why we go through the credit bureaus first, and then we escalate it to the furnisher secondly. And then they have to update the credit reports when that information changes. A lot of times, again, they just don't do that. Now, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, Section 611, this is your right to dispute inaccurate information. This is where the meat and potatoes of all of this stuff is, right? You can dispute any information on your credit report that you believe is inaccurate, incomplete, misleading, or not verifiable, right? And when you submit these disputes, you can always submit it through mail, online, or through the telephone. It's recommended, and you're going to learn in this program why we only dispute through the mail. We do use the phone sometimes. If it's dealing with inquiries, we're trying to get those off in 24 hours, or updating personal information with your lender and the credit bureaus, right? So Section 623 of the FCRA, this is responsibilities of furnishers again, right? And again, this regulates the conduct of those data furnishers, who are entities that report their credit information to the credit bureaus. Again, banks, credit card companies, credit unions, auto lenders, mortgage lenders, debt collectors, and other kinds of furnishers. And again, their responsibilities is to just report that information accurately, correct those errors, investigate those disputes, and update that information whenever it changes. And again, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Section 1692G, for validation of debt. This is where the meat and potatoes is for these third-party collection companies. You don't want to do the whole, you don't have a signature, et cetera, et cetera. There's a way to go about doing that where you're leveraging this particular law, which holds them accountable. This section of the FDCPA establishes your rights to request what's called validation of the debt, right, from the collection company. And I'm going to give you guys some more tidbits on, disputing collections once we get to that section in this course, right? So we're going to deep dive into all of this type of stuff that we're going over right now. This is just kind of introductory, right? So this section applies specifically to third-party debt collectors. It's an initial validation notice, and within 5 days of first contacting you as a consumer, they must provide written notice containing the amount of the debt, the name of the creditor, a statement of the consumer's rights to dispute the debt, and a few other things. Again, like I said, we'll get into later on in the course. Now, how these sections work together. Again, these are the legal provisions that regulate the different parts of the credit reporting system, right? So the functions are, again, 609 of the FCRA allows you to request your credit file. Section 611 of the FCRA provides you with the right to dispute any inaccurate, unverifiable, or incomplete information. Section 623 of the Fair Credit Reporting Act regulates lenders reporting credit information. And then, of course, the FDCPA, which allows you to request validation of debts. And together, these sections form the basic legal framework that you're going to learn how to rely on when correcting credit report errors and disputing these collections accounts to get these things removed off of your actual credit report. So now we're going to go over the 5 major FICO factors. Now, these are very important when it comes to the optimization of your actual credit report, because the dispute process is one thing, but we want to help you optimize your credit report. And we're going to deep dive into how to actually optimize all of these various factors when it comes to your FICO score. We're not worried about Vantage. FICO, especially FICO 8, is the score model that most lenders and furnishers are using to approve you for credit applications, right? So the main ones are payment history, right, which makes up 192 points when it comes to your overall FICO score. So that's a lot of points. This is why payment history matters so much, right? Then there's utilization, which makes up 30% on 165 points, right? So these 2 factors alone outweigh everything else on your credit report, right? If you can maintain and manage both of these 2 factors, your credit score will be okay, right? Next thing is the age of credit. There's nothing you can really do about that. There are some hacks that we can use to add some age, but you just have to let these accounts season. That makes up 15% or 83 total FICO points. Then there's credit mix, which makes up 10%, and new credit, right, which is basically the inquiries that you have that make up 55%. The less inquiries, the better, right? That make up 55 points. And again, the less inquiries that you have, the better it's going to be when it comes to your overall, your overall score.